Now to the war in Gaza, and Hamas has responded to the U.S.-backed proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza, saying it wants some amendments to the deal. Neither Israel nor Hamas have publicly committed to the plan. The United States had been hoping for an outright acceptance of the deal by both sides. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has spent the last few days traveling across the Middle East, trying to promote it. On Monday, the UN Security Council endorsed the plan, calling on both Israel and Hamas to enact it immediately without conditions. Let's take a closer look now at the original deal that Blinken is trying to get all sides to sign up to. It's made up of 3 phases. In the first, the release of some hostages, the return of Palestinian prisoners, and partial troop withdrawal under a 6-week truce. The second includes a permanent ceasefire yet to be negotiated. That would mean the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Strip. The third phase would focus on a plan to rebuild Gaza. Well, for more on this, let's cross over to Professor Simon Mabon. He's a Middle East analyst at Lancaster University in the UK. Thanks for being with us. Simon, Israel and Hamas are under huge pressure to approve the UN-backed ceasefire proposal for Gaza. What's your assessment of the likelihood of this deal actually getting done?
Well, yeah, you're right to say there is huge pressure here on all sides. It is pretty clear from the UN making this commitment, the Security Council passing this resolution, that there is growing pressure on Israel, on Hamas, to actually get a ceasefire. And that's unsurprising given the scale of the humanitarian suffering, the scale of the devastation across Gaza. Now, the likelihood of it actually coming off, however, is, I think, pretty difficult to assess. The first phase of the plan, as you've just outlined, is perhaps the most probable and the most likely, but it gets far thornier and far more complex when we move into phases 2 and 3, and I'm particularly worried when we get to those stages.
Now, Qatar has been hosting these truce talks, and other Arab countries like Egypt and Jordan are involved too. How much influence, Simon, do these countries have in the negotiations, especially with respect to Hamas?
Well, it's about putting pressure on Hamas, and I think in the sense that Qatar has long been an ally, a host of Hamas, not necessarily a supporter, but they've been open to playing home to some of the Hamas figures like Khaled Meshal who fled Gaza in the past. So it has a good deal of influence in that respect. And also, perhaps the more important thing is that it has the money. And Hamas is obviously particularly concerned about how Gaza is going to be rebuilt. The money has to be found somewhere, and the Gulf states, Qatar in particular, is going to have a big role to play. So I would imagine that Doha has got the ability to exert a good deal of influence. But it's not so much the Hamas side that I think is the concern here with regard to accepting this deal. We've heard key figures suggesting that they are willing to accept it. It's more on the Israeli side. I think that's where things get really complex.
Well, tell us more about how the Hamas leadership is dealing with this situation. Is it clear to you what their strategy is?
Not particularly. I think from the very offset of all of this on October 7, it's clear that the Hamas leadership has set out on a particular trajectory and found itself in waters that it didn't necessarily want to find itself in. We've heard that the actual attack that was planned was far more limited than what actually happened, and that the devastation of that terrorist attack was not what was originally intended, or at least so we're led to believe. So that tells us that there is a lack of coordination, there is a lack of a clear strategy, and that's certainly coming out with regard to what has been happening in Gaza in the months since. And that's not surprising given the political situation in Gaza, given the realities on the ground of life in Gaza in this conflict.
There's intense speculation, Simon, about what will become of Gaza after the war ends. What do you think is the most likely scenario for how that territory will be governed?
Well, it depends who you're asking here, because the international community wants the PA to be the main sort of driver of politics in
the Palestinian Authority,
in the Gaza Strip. Israel, the Palestinian Authority, yes, sorry. The Israelis are perhaps a little less inclined to do that, because that opens the door for Hamas influence. And Benjamin Netanyahu has said that there can be no Hamas in Gaza. He's hung his hat on this idea of defeating Hamas and eradicating it. And that leaves a bit of a problem, a conundrum, because understandably, the Israelis do not want a Hamas presence in Gaza because they have just endured this absolutely devastating terrorist attack. But at the same time, the international community wants a democratic space for people to engage politically in Gaza. And that could potentially, as it has done in the past, lead to Hamas. And that would be unpalatable for many in Israel and indeed many in the international community. So there's a real conundrum here as to what happens next. But I think in terms of the most likely scenario, I would imagine it would be some type of either Arab or international peacekeeping force that would serve as a transitionary sort of role. But then what happens after that is the big question. It's kicking the question of the quote unquote the day after just a little bit further down the road.
Simon, thank you very much. That was Simon Mabon, Middle East analyst and professor at Lancaster University in the UK. Let's cross straight over to our Jerusalem correspondent, Rebecca Ritters. Rebecca, what are you hearing about efforts to finalize this deal? We understand that Hamas is proposing new conditions.
Yeah, that's right, Terry. Late last evening, we got word that Hamas had finally handed over their response, their official response. It was much awaited, to the Egyptian and Qatari negotiators. And within that response, we're hearing that amendments have been requested, that they haven't given their all-out approval of the current deal on the table. We know that it's also now with US negotiators, and all three parties are mulling over just the requests that are being asked by Hamas. So we don't know any detail about what those are. We do know that there was a more stringent timeline given to a permanent ceasefire, and that Hamas have reiterated or reaffirmed that their priority is indeed that permanent ceasefire. We heard from a Hamas spokesperson who said that this is a clear reaffirmation of our commitment to a ceasefire, and that the response is responsible, serious and positive, certainly wanting to at least appear that they are trying to work towards this agreement, or working towards perhaps a slightly different agreement. Now, it's probably not the response that the US were hoping for. We know that they would have much preferred an all-out thumbs up from Hamas, but I think it comes as no surprise, as Hamas have been saying all along, that they wouldn't enter into a deal that didn't have a clear outcome of a permanent ceasefire.
What about the Israeli side, Rebecca? The U.S. says Israel has agreed to the deal. Why have we not heard that from Israel directly?
Well, Israel has been sending some mixed messages when it comes to this deal. The US has certainly been selling this deal as an Israeli-backed deal and saying that Israel has been on board. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, when he was here, again said that he was reaffirmed by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, that they were behind the deal and that they were committed to it. But we didn't hear anything official. Now, yesterday, before Hamas's response, we got word, sort of by way of an Israeli government spokesperson, largely thought to be from the Prime Minister's office, to say that, again, that Israel were behind the deal, but that their priority was, of course, to be able to complete their military aims, meaning that they wanted to completely dismantle Hamas and therefore tacitly don't agree to a permanent ceasefire. We know that Israel is now, the government is very reliant on the far-right factions of its government, and they are saying that they will break up the coalition, the governing coalition, if it enters into any agreement that moves towards a permanent ceasefire before they complete their military aims. The US trying to sell it as to Israel, basically saying that they have completed their military aims, that they have destroyed Hamas, that Hamas isn't capable of carrying out another October 7, and therefore trying to be able to tell those far-right people that they have completed those aims, but clearly not really getting that over the line. And I think we wouldn't have seen an all-out commitment to that proposal from the Israeli side either.
Rebecca, thank you. Our correspondent Rebecca Ritters there in Jerusalem.